Welcome to Roundtail Radio. Through our conversations, we discover the holy and the ordinary, look for moments of grace and peace, and redefine what we talk about when we talk about faith. Good morning, Ed.
Good morning, Leslie.
How you doing?
Good. Happy Monday.
Happy Monday. So we discussed a couple weeks ago how much we love this idea of curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And you actually brought into the conversation we've been having around here one of the other values we used in our What Matters Most series, imagination. You kind of brought that around, and we were talking about that with relation to creativity. So we thought we would bring that conversation onto the podcast today, because that's kind of what we've been chatting about and all the things we've been kind of swirling around in our brains. Mm-hmm. Help us all. So do you have a thought to start us off with today?
I think I do.
I bet you.
I'll throw a couple of things out there.
Nice. I'm just going to shimmy your mic real fast.
Kick the can down the road.
Thank
you.
You're welcome.
Equipment adjustment.
It happens.
It's all good. So part of what happened during the summer is I came across this book by a man named Rick Rubin called The Creative Act, A Way of Being.
Okay.
And I was interested in that title because it sounds like it's a singular thing, a creative act.
Sure.
But then he calls the book A Way of Being. So in a way, the act is about the way in which an entire life is lived. It's not an isolated action. He was a music producer and probably one of the greatest music producers in the last few decades. And I have to say I was not very aware of his work, but there we are. And he also worked with kinds of music that I don't listen to at all. So that's probably another reason why I hadn't heard about him. But I came across this book because a friend of mine who's a writer had also purchased the book at the same time. And so we kind of let each other know about it. And then I started listening to it, which I don't listen to many books, as you know. That's kind of unusual for me. And I think it's just the best book on creativity that I've ever read. And it's about his observations of the creative process. And I think one of the things that we're missing often when we talk about faith is actually the creative process as it relates to faith.
Okay.
And what does that actually look like, when we think it through? What does it mean to be faithful? And I really haven't come across many books in my life that describe that.
Yeah.
Right? Would that be
no,
true?
yeah, I wouldn't have it.
And yet here's a man, Rick Rubin, who has carefully observed the creative process. And everything that he says, I have found, as I'm listening to the book, is relatable to music and art and writing, but also relatable to faith.
Yeah.
And he does make it clear during the course of the book that he's someone who has faith. He says openly, he said, I have this knowingness about God. That's the way he describes it.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, which I thought was a very interesting way of describing that.
Yeah.
And so he sees the creative process in that sense as also a sacred process. So I think that going forward, the more we can talk about curiosity and imagination as it relates to faith, the richer and deeper that discussion is going to become.
Sure.
Because I think the danger is that often faith gets reduced to a few morals, or we might say it's about living a good life or something. And it can be about that.
Sure.
But it can also be about so much more than that. And so that's where I am so far.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think so often people tend to label themselves as creative or not creative.
Yes.
As two self-creative labelers.
Yeah, there you go.
I think it's really interesting to, instead of thinking it as a skill, as a practice, as an innate thing that we all have, whether we dive into it and try it out or not. I think tying into last week's podcast, there's a vulnerability there when it comes to it. There is the potential for failure.
Maybe the necessity.
Exactly. Oh, I like that. Yeah. And that can be quite intimidating. I had sent you last week this video from what was like 1994 or something.
Yeah, I didn't see the date on it.
It was the 90s, I think.
Yeah.
Of a talk John Cleese of Monty Python fame. Although in my house, he was actually better known for Faulty Towers.
Oh, yes.
My parents loved
Yes.
Faulty Towers. And so that was always
he
the
spans the generations.
He really does. That was the reference in my house. Although obviously Monty Python is right up there. Do you hear? I probably reference Monty Python once a week to the choir.
Love it.
Even if it's just,
It
and now for
lives.
something completely different. But, oh, excuse me, my phone's here. But it's kind of, so the talk he gave is like this 30-minute talk, which to me flies by, especially because he intersperses it with light bulb jokes.
Light bulb jokes.
You know, how many people does it take to whatever change
He
a light
covers
bulb?
a lot of ground.
He really does. Some of them are kind of the time, which is fine. But he talks about the mode one can put oneself into. And he has identified it as the open mode and the closed mode, which I thought was a really clear, interesting way of putting it, because the open mode is when you are, you push things aside, you set aside a place and time for yourself to let your creativity go wild. And then closed mode is the mode we get into when we're getting stuff done. And he doesn't mean that in a negative way. He actually says that, when you're in the open mode and you're, you have all these ideas and all these wonderful things, it's actually imperative to then use the closed mode to try them out, to go into them and not be constantly in the open mode, because be like, well, what if? Well, what if? That you need the sort of functionality.
Yeah, implementation.
Of the implementation, exactly. And I thought that was really interesting. It put me in mind of the times where we've had sort of, say, planning meetings, but they're more dreaming meetings where I feel like, you have those ideas and you don't really know who came up with them or where they came from, and they just kind of bubble and sparkle and glitter. And that to me always feels like the best version of an open mode. I know in his talk, he was talking about setting aside time for yourself, and that sort of is almost a meditative thing. And I appreciated that he commented on how like the first half an hour is just you fighting the list of things that you feel like you should be doing.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then taking an hour to actually do it. I will say, this is the only thing I sort of questioned about. I highly recommend this talk for anyone who can't tell. But for me, I found I seem to function best most in an open mode in a group setting. It's the one time a group project and I get along really well is this idea of where it's just like spitballing and ideas, and when everyone's in open mode together,
right?
That to me is like, that's peak dreaming and scheming and excitement.
Yeah.
That's my sort of best version of open mode, is when we're doing it together.
Well, I love the fact, first of all, that you bring that up. And by the way, it's a remarkable video. And,
it's so good.
And the thing that impressed me about it, by the way, is the fact that John Cleese, who's, has a comic side, right? It's a very, I don't want to say serious, but he takes the subject very seriously.
Yeah.
Because he feels that if creativity is absent in an environment, right, it's not good for anyone. So I love the simplicity of the terms open and closed. And I had to get past sometimes I hear the word closed and I attach a negativity to that.
Yeah.
So I had to get past that, because the closed part of it is absolutely essential. Without, as you say, without that, you can have imagination, but you have to have implementation, right? The two have to go together. But I was thinking that it would be really interesting to have a group of people read through the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and describe where they see Jesus as open and where they see him as closed.
Oh, interesting.
And that came out of that video. And it would be equally interesting for us as individuals to sit down, let's say on a Tuesday, very quickly, 10-minute, leave it at that, but look back at Monday and say, where was I definitely open? And where was I closed? Where did I, try to be open and it got derailed? And that's a very accessible way of helping ourselves to be more creative. Because John Cleese makes it very clear that he He detaches creativity from any kind of standard measure of intelligence. He
Yes.
said this is not about IQ. No relationship between the two at all. And that's very helpful. But it very much coincides with this vision that we're all born with the image of God, and that image is related to imagination. And so that's the God-given gift that helps us to face what has to be faced. So in all those ways, I found that his presentation was really helpful in terms of thinking about creativity. I guess just one other comment. I have a friend, very creative man, is an architect and a priest. And he's designed some of the most extraordinary worship spaces in the country.
Wow.
So his vocation turned out to be architectural design of worship spaces. And he's also now a parish priest. But I asked him once, so I said, when you want to get juiced up, jazzed up with your imagination, creativity, what do you read? Where do you go in the bookstore? Well, he said, I never go to the religion section. Never going to find it. He said, I always go to the business section.
Interesting.
He said, that's where you'll find people trying to use creativity and imagination, usually, in the interest of growing a business, right? Sales and all of that. But he said it can be much larger than that. And he said, you will often find a level of dedication to the imagination that you will not find in religious books that are produced. So I thought that was very interesting. And by the way, I think that's true. Over the years, I've kind of steered clear of the religion section and tend to gravitate more towards the business section. And oftentimes, those people in the business world will be very compassionate as well as imaginative. And they're trying to take care of their employees, but also to do it in a way that, is benefiting the company.
Yeah.
So anyway, random thoughts.
No, I think that's really interesting because, that's where innovation happens, right? Because innovation is necessary to be competitive in the business world. And so that innovation, you have to find ways to promote creativity within yourself to therefore help your company. I remember, I don't know how many years ago it was, but when, all these mega companies started providing this sounds so ridiculous now, but outdoor space.
Oh yeah.
For their
A picnic table
for their employees, or Google is known for their campus, and now Apple with there's gym, and there's this amazing cafeteria with all organic foods, and they have their own this and all of these ideas of imagination and creativity, which then spurs on more competitiveness within their corporations, which I think is very interesting. Yeah. And then especially comes from a place of compassion, but also self-interest, which seems to, if they align, then fine.
Right? Why not?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I think where the church pushes this into a new, area is that, for example, when Jesus says, unless you become as a child, you can't enter the kingdom of God. So when we think about, our little corporations, unlike a company that's consisting of adults, right?
Yeah.
We're an intergeneration. We're intergenerational by definition.
We are.
And we go forward at our own peril if we do not tap the wisdom of children.
Yeah.
So building that into communities going forward, I would say, would be a major departure from the way things have been.
Right.
And here's a way to access this, wonderful spirit. In fact, I think you and I have spoken about this before, but there's this wonderful book called The Secret Spiritual Life of Children.
Yeah, you were telling us about that.
Such a great book. But it starts off in a very innocent way because this man says, I think especially when he was a father, or was a father of a very young child, and the child would stop. And I think you can identify with this, every 3 feet, to say, what's that? What's that? What's that? Or just pick it up, examine it or whatever. But he said a lot of times he noticed that his children, I guess, seemed to be looking at things that didn't seem to have an obvious endpoint to, from his view. What are they looking at?
Yeah.
Or they would suddenly point at something and say, when they were old enough to do so, would say, look. And so he could never exactly figure out what that was about. And then he realized that, is it possible that their perception is so open that they're seeing things of a spiritual nature that we've simply lost. And there's a wonderful scene in this movie, Wings of Desire, German film that came out during the Cold War, of this woman and her daughter on a bus. And the little girl looks up at the top of a church, and there's an angel there.
Oh, yeah.
And he's all dressed in black. You know, it's kind of an interesting character. But she looks up and goes, I think she said, you know, Mommy, an angel. And she's saying, what, you know, I can't be bothered with that right now.
Yeah, yeah.
So again, it's getting that feeling back of opening up the lenses of the perception. And that's what we really want to be doing, so that we see what needs to be seen and notice what must be noticed. And imagination helps us to do that.
I love that, because entering into that with them takes a little bit of discipline.
A little.
And a
little patience.
Truckload of patience, yeah. But it's so fascinating because Mare Bear does the thing I call the squat.
All right.
Right? Which is this thing, and it's amazing how toddlers can do it. They're just standing and then they're, shoom,
yeah.
they're down.
Flexibility, I think that's called.
It's incredible. But then, so we'll be walking, we have this sort of gravel path in our woods, and, you know, from 5 foot whatever of me looking down on it, it looks gray. Yeah, there's some variation in color or whatever. Blah, blah, blah.
Not that interesting.
Not that, it's gravel. It's rocks. The way that she has, like 3 feet, I think is an overestimation for how far we get before we just squat.
Oh, yeah.
And then we're up, and then 2 steps and squat. And she finds the most incredible rocks in this sea of gray. She found this one the other day that was like burgundy.
Oh, gee.
The whole thing was like burgundy and whatever. And she was like, here you go. It was her logo. I was
You who think there's nothing here to be seen, take this.
It's like a gold one, and then all these amazing shapes. And it's like a perfect example of just like perspective and taking the time. I know one of our friends was telling a story a couple of years ago about how, you know, she tries to walk to the mailbox with her kids, and it feels like hours, because they have to stop and look at every ant.
Right.
And at every flower. Although I will say, Mare Bear has started to clean the driveway.
Oh my gosh.
She takes the branch, takes off the side. I'm like, well, thank you.
That's
very helpful.
Sweet.
But it's a really interesting thing, because it's like, well, that's the first time they've seen blankety blank.
Right.
You know, for me, that's a helpful reminder of like, well, if you've never seen that before, what would you think about it? What would you imagine it to be in your kind of framework of information you have so far in your database of what the world is like?
Right.
Which I think is really interesting, because I take it very seriously that her perspective of the world is everything we've shown her.
Yep.
And is currently limited to that.
Yes.
Which I think is a little daunting as a parent, because you want to do it right.
Of course. Yeah.
Or show them all the things, you know, and let her make up her own mind. But this idea of play, I wanted to go back to the idea of play, because to tell another personal story, actually one of the first conversations my husband and I ever had was about how we play for a living. That the language, for me, it's the language, right? Because I play the organ, and it's literally in the name. For him, he's a children's toy designer, so it's like, if you don't have play, you're doing something wrong. You're probably not going to be a very good designer. And so we kind of had that first initial connection over the fact that we both play for a living, and I just really enjoyed that. And the computer's doing something. What's happening? It's fine. Being dramatic, it'll be fine. And I really enjoyed that as conversation.
Yeah.
So
love it.
Those are my 2 thoughts about play, because I think, and it felt sort of like countercultural, like, oh, we play. Woo.
Right. Yeah.
Woo. You know, and that's so rare that's a thing that you can kind of celebrate and acknowledge together.
So I keep going back to these 2 words, you know, like implementation and imagination, and how they need each other, right? But that play experience that can so often seem trivial in our culture, or, hey, we've got serious work to do. We got to bear down people, you know, I mean, that's the kind of language often,
right?
Which accentuates the pressure to do work that is measured by a norm that somebody else has established.
Smart goals.
There you go. Right?
Smart goals, and I have
Exactly.
mixed feelings about those.
And me too. And the thing about play is it doesn't work according to those measures.
No.
Right? And in terms of the time and the space that we need to create. I loved it when John Cleese said there are 5 essential ingredients, but 2 of them were time.
2 of them were time. Yeah, I love that.
And so I think attention must be paid to that. But the one thing when I was listening, so having listened to John Cleese, I was then listening again to Rick Rubin, who said that, part of being creative is finding the thing that you do that's mildly distracting that actually frees the other part of the mind to play. Because you can, in a sense, be doing these 2 things almost at once.
Yeah.
And a classic example is driving.
Oh, sure.
Right? You're paying attention, hopefully. Better not make any assumptions there. Trying to pay attention. But my experience for example, if I sit down to meditate, I just want to fall asleep.
Really?
Yeah, it's just, that is never going to be a good beginning for me to get creative.
Got it.
Sometimes walking will help, but I have to confess, it's often driving.
I can appreciate that.
All right, so you get in the car, you start driving, the mind is focused on that, and all of a sudden, as if out of the nowhere, an idea pops up. Because again, it sort of relaxes the pressure. Now I'm not trying to think about it. I've already, and you would do the same thing, we've already primed the mind.
Right.
Right? The mind gets it. Okay, I get it. You're working on a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, but give me some space.
Yeah.
Here, back off.
Yeah. I always say to let it percolate.
Yes. And that way we can, by focusing on one thing, we actually give the mind a chance to work away. There's actually a term that physicists use for this, believe it or not.
Tell me.
It's called the bed, bath, and bus theory. And this is because 3 amazing innovations came to physicists and scientists over the years because one of them just had been working, got into bed and dreamt of the solution. One got into the bathtub after a long day, and one just got onto a bus, apparently somewhere, in Eastern European city in the 1900s, popped on the bus, and lo and behold, was able to have this epiphany. But they weren't working at the time.
Yeah.
Right? The mind was already doing it for them. To me, then, it's down to trust.
Trust. That's a big word.
It's a big word.
That's a big word. What are we trusting?
And that it's already, the mind is already knows what it knows. It knows how to work. It knows how to puzzle things through. But we almost have to find a way to back away from it. And that releases a certain energy in us. And we're not very good at that in our culture. We tend to work longer, work harder, expend more energy on the closed aspect, the implementation aspect. And it's often not very helpful for us.
Well, there's that sort of almost deification of the hustle culture.
Yeah.
That if I work harder, if I put more hours in, I'm going to be more successful than the person next to me. I'll get to the top of whatever I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a saying from that's attributed to Einstein, but I'm not sure. Yeah, but anyway, we'll give him credit for it. But he said if he was given an hour to solve a problem, he'd spend the first 50 minutes just pondering. Not actually trying to solve it, but just kind of trying to think about. I think the way he phrased it was, I'd use the first 50 minutes to think about the most important question that would have to be asked.
Interesting.
To resolve that issue.
Yeah.
Because then the feeling is I'll be able to figure it out in 10 minutes.
Well, you were telling a story yesterday about how I believe the Quaker community has a similar approach to problem solving. What was that story?
Yeah, the Clearness Committee. And the idea is if someone's not clear about a path, that the community, members of the community will get together, the Quakers, also known as Society of Friends, and they will come together and they'll sit with this person, but they're not allowed to give advice or counsel or book suggestions, which is a real bummer.
I was going to say that was hard for you.
Can't believe that. That's got to be a major mistake. But anyway, but they can ask any question they want.
Yeah.
And that goes on from an agreed period of time. It might be 30 minutes, 60 minutes. And then the idea is they can come back another time if the person needs it. But the assumption is that the questions will help to release the answer within the person already knows what to do
Yeah.
at some level. And that level cannot be accessed easily all the time.
Right.
This is sort of what friends are supposed to do,
Right.
right?
It was like, this sounds like, yeah, like a really good friendship. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. I think a great friend, a great friendship, lots of room for questions. You know, that if you hear somebody saying, right, well, look, here's what I would do,
Sure.
then that short circuits the whole process.
Yes.
Right. So stay away from that. But I love that idea of the clearness committee. And I think that's interesting that is actually an important part of a religious tradition.
Yeah.
You know, in Protestantism, it tends to be, listen to the sermon. It'll all get figured out there. No, it won't. You know?
It's a good starting place.
It can be.
For ideas and thoughts.
It can be. But we put too much on it, you know, really.
Sure.
Whereas if you had
Says the preacher.
Exactly. Let's back off from that a little bit. But we know that people get insights from what they experience in worship, which is wonderful. Right? Listening to the music, listening to whatever it is. But it's in this interaction with these questions, that's where the deep stuff really gets released.
I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think questions are a big thing.
A gift.
They really are.
And I guess that's why Jesus asks, 300 of them, and, answers about 2.
There you go.
Yeah. So he's big on questions.
The original non-mansplainer.
Yes, exactly. You go figure it out for yourself.
There you go.
Here's a question to chew on.
I love it.
Yeah.
So speaking of book recommendations,
Yes.
you have a new book
I've got a book for us to read.
for us to read. You got me a copy. I'm very excited about it. The scale of it I find appealing as a person. I'm literally, so can I tell you, the Stolen Focus book that we're still trying.
Yes.
Yeah. It's due again. It was due, and then it got renewed, and then it's due again. And I asked me if I've read any more.
I have a few of those too.
I have great hopes for this one.
I think this one it looks very accessible.
I think so.
The print is pretty large. I
appreciate
I see a lot of positives here. But
so embarrassing.
It's by a guy named William Carter, who is a jazz pianist and a Presbyterian pastor. Lives in northeastern Pennsylvania.
I love it.
I happened to meet him on a webinar. He's a lovely guy, very creative. The book is called Thriving on a Riff, Jazz in the Spiritual Life.
It's perfect.
So
We had some jazz music in worship recently.
We did. And I'm telling you, it was amazing.
We're
right?
so on theme these days. Look at us go.
Yeah. So this gives us a chance to kind of, again, I think this is the other great thing about imagination is, feed it. So you have that experience. And sometimes I think we have experiences and then we sort of let them drop away.
Sure.
So how do you feed it and then say, oh, wait a second, something was there. What did I feel there?
Yeah.
That was the other thing. I definitely comes through Rick Rubin. I'm not sure that John Cleese said this, but Rick Rubin is big on what did you feel in that moment? Because it can go so quickly to our heads, right?
Sure.
The whole discussion. So what did you feel? And he said, if you felt something that is akin to ecstasy, stay with that.
Yeah.
If it's joy, if it felt like energy, stay with that. Keep working in that direction. And I think, again, often in our culture, we're like, no, take the harder path,
Whatever. Yeah. That feels real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think I'm really looking forward to reading this book with you, and maybe we'll have more, insights as we.
Yeah. So grab a copy, friends. I'll pop it up on social media so you can see what we're reading.
Perfect.
And we'll go from there. I'm excited to dive in. It sounds great.
Me too.
Great title. So
yeah,
good things to come on that. So we really enjoy these conversations with you about curiosity and creativity and all those wonderful things. Roundhill Radio is brought to you by the friends and members of Roundhill Community Church. For more information, please visit roundhillradio.org.
If you enjoyed this podcast, there are a few things that you can do that would make a big difference to us. Like the video, subscribe if you aren't, and click the notification bell and select all. Thank you.